The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered porch, casting harsh shadows across the girl who sat chained to the wooden post like a forgotten piece of property. Lucy's tears had dried hours ago, leaving salt tracks down her dust-covered cheeks. The iron shackle around her ankle had rubbed raw, but she'd learned not to cry about pain. Crying only made things worse. The ranch house sat alone in the vast desert, surrounded by scrub brush and red rock formations that stretched toward distant mesas. Once this had been Apache hunting grounds, where warriors rode free across the endless landscape. Now it was just another broken-down homestead, miles from the nearest neighbor, where terrible things could happen without witness. From inside the house came the sound of her stepfather's boots on wooden floors, the clink of bottles, the low murmur of voices. Wade Garrett had company again, men who laughed too loud and looked at Lucy with eyes that made her skin crawl. Her mother had tried to protect her once, but Martha had been in the ground for 6 months now, and Wade's patience for weak women and their weak children had died with her. Crying don't fix nothing, Wade had said that morning, fastening the chain around her ankle with practiced efficiency. Maybe a day in the sun will teach you to keep them tears to yourself. Lucy pressed her back against the porch post and tried to find shade that didn't exist. The desert stretched endlessly around her, beautiful and terrible under the blazing sky. Her mother used to tell her stories about this land, about the Apache who knew every waterhole and hidden canyon, who could survive where others would perish. Martha had been part Apache herself, though she'd hidden it from Wade. "Strong women don't cry where men can see," she'd whispered to Lucy during one of Wade's rages. "But tears in private aren't shame, baby girl. Sometimes they're the only thing that keeps us human." The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, a small disturbance against the shimmering heat. Lucy squinted through the glare, watching a lone rider approach on horseback. Her heart jumped between hope and terror. Strangers could mean rescue, or they could mean more trouble. With Wade, it was usually trouble. The rider drew closer, and Lucy could make out details. A man on a paint horse, sitting easy in the saddle despite the heat. His hat was pulled low, and something about the way he moved spoke of years in the saddle, of distances traveled and hardships endured. As he approached the house, Lucy shrank back against the post, making herself as small as possible. The stranger reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his dark eyes taking in the scene with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read danger in the details. He was younger than Wade, but weathered by sun and wind, with the kind of lean strength that came from hard living. His skin bore the bronze of mixed heritage, and when his gaze fell on Lucy, something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps of something he'd hoped never to see again. "Afternoon," he called out, his voice carrying the slight roughness of a man who didn't waste words. "Name's Jake Crow Dog. Looking for water for me and my horse, if you can spare it." From inside the house came the scrape of chairs, the sound of Wade's boots approaching the door. Lucy's muscles tensed, and she saw the stranger notice her reaction, his eyes moving from her face to the chain around her ankle. Wade stepped onto the porch, bottle in hand, 3 other men crowding behind him. They were the type who drifted from ranch to ranch, working when they had to, taking what they wanted when they could. Wade himself was a big man, gone soft around the middle, but still dangerous, with small eyes and hands that had never learned gentleness. "Water's 50 cents, Wade said, sizing up the newcomer with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everything in terms of what it could get him. "Well's out back." Jake's eyes moved deliberately from Wade to the men behind him, then back to Lucy. The silence stretched like a held breath in the desert heat. "What about the girl?" Jake asked quietly. Wade's expression darkened. "What about her? She's being taught a lesson about keeping her mouth shut and her tears to herself. Ain't no concern of yours." Jake's hand rested casually near his gun belt, but Lucy could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his horse shifted restlessly beneath him as if sensing its rider's mood. Seems like cruel weather to leave a child chained outside. Seems like you might want to mind your own business, stranger. Wade stepped forward, and his men moved with him. This is my property, my family, my rules. The word family hung in the air like a lie even Wade couldn't quite sell. Lucy wasn't his blood, and everyone in these parts knew Martha had only married him because a woman alone with a child had few choices in the desert. Jake studied Wade for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Reckon you're right, ain't my business. He touched the brim of his hat. I'll just water my horse and be on my way. As Jake rode toward the well, Lucy felt something die inside her chest. Another stranger, another chance for help that had ridden away. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's stories about brave Apache warriors who never left their people behind. But when she opened her eyes, Jake was still there, watering his horse with deliberate slowness. And when his dark gaze met hers across the yard, she saw something that made her heart flutter with dangerous hope. He wasn't leaving, not yet. Jake took his time watering his paint horse, his movements unhurried despite the tension crackling in the desert air. Years of scouting for the cavalry had taught him patience, how to read a situation before acting, how to spot the difference between a man protecting his family and a man hiding his cruelty. Wade and his companions had retreated to the shade of the porch, passing the bottle between them and watching Jake with the lazy attention of predators certain of their dominance. They outnumbered him 4-1, and this was their territory. But Jake had survived worse odds in Apache country, and he'd learned long ago that sometimes the measure of a man wasn't in the fights he could win, but in the ones he couldn't walk away from. The girl, Lucy, he'd heard Wade call her, sat motionless against the porch post, her eyes tracking his every movement. She was maybe 10 or 11, all bones and tangled hair, with the hollow look of a child who'd learned not to hope for rescue. But there was something else in her face, something that reminded Jake of his own grandmother's stories about Apache women who'd endured unspeakable hardships without breaking. "That horse is drinking awful slow," Wade called out, amusement thick in his voice. "You planning to set up camp in my yard?" Jake straightened, letting his hand rest on his horse's neck. "Good horse takes care to drink enough. Desert's unforgiving to those who rush." It was a mild statement, but the men on the porch heard the underlying message. Wade's smile faded slightly. "You got somewhere to be, stranger?" "Nowhere particular." Jake led his horse closer to the house, stopping just at the edge of what might be considered respectful distance. "Heard there was ranch work to be had in these parts." "Not here. We're full up." Jake nodded, his dark eyes moving deliberately to Lucy. The chain around her ankle caught the sunlight, and he saw how she tried to wrap cloth around the shackle to protect her skin. A child's resourcefulness in the face of adult cruelty. "Mind if I ask what the girl did to earn such punishment?" Wade's face darkened. "I told you once to mind your business." "Just curious. In my experience, children don't usually require restraints unless they're wild as mustangs." Jake's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "And she don't look wild to me." One of Wade's men, a weaselly character with nervous eyes, laughed uneasily. "She cries too much. Wade's just teaching her to toughen up." "Shut up, Roe," Wade snapped, but the damage was done. Jake looked at Lucy again, seeing the way she flinched at the sound of raised voices, the careful way she held herself to avoid rattling the chain. "Crying's a natural thing for children. My grandmother used to say tears were how the heart cleaned itself." Your grandmother sounds like she raised weak children, Wade said, stepping forward. This girl's mother filled her head with nonsense about feelings and such. Time she learned the world don't care about her tears. Maybe not, Jake agreed mildly, but decent folks do. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Wade's hand moved toward the gun at his hip and his companions shifted into more aggressive positions. Jake remained perfectly still, but Lucy could see the change in him. The way his breathing slowed, the way his weight settled like a cougar preparing to spring. You calling me indecent? I'm calling it like I see it. And what I see is a grown man who gets his satisfaction from chaining a child to a porch in 100-degree heat. Wade drew his gun, but Jake was faster. His Colt appeared in his hand with the fluid grace of long practice, the barrel steady and sure. Easy, Jake said softly. No need for anyone to get hurt over a conversation. The other men had their hands on their weapons, but none had drawn. Jake's reputation might be unknown to them, but his speed wasn't. You're making a mistake, stranger, Wade said, his gun still half drawn. You're outnumbered. Been outnumbered before. Usually turns out better than you'd expect. Jake's voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd faced death more than once and found it lacking. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to put that gun away and we're going to discuss this like civilized men. Discuss what? That girl belongs to me. No child belongs to anyone like property. Jake's eyes flicked to Lucy, who was watching the standoff with wide eyes. But let's say she's your responsibility. What kind of man are you teaching her to trust? Wade's face flushed red. The kind who don't tolerate backtalk and tears and feminine weakness. And what happens when she grows up? You think she'll remember your lessons with gratitude? Jake's voice was quiet, deadly. Or you think she'll remember the man who chained her like an animal and count the days until she's strong enough to leave? For a moment something flickered in Wade's expression, uncertainty, perhaps even shame. But it was quickly replaced by anger. She ain't going nowhere. This is her home. This ain't a home, Jake said, looking around the dusty yard, the broken fence, the girl chained to the porch. This is a prison with a roof. Lucy made a small sound, not quite a sob, but close. Jake heard it and felt something ancient and protective rise in his chest, something that spoke of Apache traditions about protecting the helpless and honoring the innocent. Last chance, Wade said, his gun now fully drawn. Ride out now or we'll plant you in the desert. Jake studied the four men facing him, calculating odds and angles. He'd been in worse situations, but never with a child's welfare hanging in the balance. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is choose the right battle, even when he knows it might be his last. Tell you what, Jake said, holstering his weapon with deliberate calm. I'll make you a deal. Wade kept his gun trained on Jake but didn't fire. What kind of deal? Give me 1 day with the girl. Let me take her to town, get her cleaned up, fed proper. If she wants to come back after that, I'll bring her. But if she chooses different... Jake shrugged. Well, seems to me a man secure in his care wouldn't worry about a child choosing to stay. Wade's eyes narrowed. What's in it for you? Peace of mind. And maybe you get to prove you're the kind of man worth staying with. It was a gamble, and Jake knew it, but sometimes the only way to save someone was to trust that deep down even cruel men wanted to believe they were decent. Wade looked at his men, then back at Jake. And if she runs, then you'll know where you stand. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Lucy held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe. Finally, Wade lowered his gun. 1 day, but if you ain't back by sunset tomorrow, I'll hunt you both down. Jake nodded, his expression betraying none of the relief he felt. Fair enough. As Wade moved to unlock the chain around Lucy's ankle, Jake caught the girl's eye and saw something that made his chest tight. Trust. Fragile and desperate, but real. He just hoped he was worthy of it. Lucy's legs trembled as she stood for the first time in 18 hours, the chain falling away from her ankle with a sound like broken promises. Jake moved forward slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, treating her with the careful respect he'd show a wounded animal. "Easy there, little one," he said softly. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her first steps were unsteady. Jake offered his arm for support, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her small hand was scorching hot from the desert sun, and Jake could feel the fever that had built up during her ordeal. Wade watched from the porch, his expression unreadable. "You got until sunset tomorrow. Don't make me come looking for you." Jake helped Lucy onto his horse, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She was light as a bird, all sharp angles and fragile bones. As they rode away from the ranch house, Jake felt the weight of 4 pairs of eyes on his back, but he didn't look around. Some battles were won by walking away at the right moment. The nearest town was Copper Creek, a 2-hour ride through desert and scrubland. Lucy sat silent in front of him, her small body rigid with exhaustion and residual fear. Jake let the quiet stretch between them, knowing that trust, like water in the desert, couldn't be rushed. Halfway to town, they stopped at a small spring hidden among red rocks, a place Jake's grandmother had shown him years ago, sacred to the Apache but forgotten by most white settlers. He helped Lucy down from the horse and knelt beside the clear water. "This spring has been here since the beginning of time," he said, filling his canteen. "My grandmother's people believed it had healing powers." Lucy looked at him with new interest. "Your grandmother was Apache?" "Full-blood Chiricahua. Toughest woman I ever knew." Jake wet his bandana and gently cleaned the dust from Lucy's face. "She used to say that strength wasn't about never crying. It was about crying when you needed to, then getting up and doing what had to be done." Lucy's composure cracked slightly. "Wade says crying is for weaklings. Wade's never faced down a Apache war party or birthed a child in a blizzard or buried half her family to disease." Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "He don't know nothing about real strength." They drank from the spring and rested in the shade while Jake's horse grazed. Slowly Lucy began to talk about her mother, who died of fever the previous winter, about Wade, who'd grown crueler after Martha's death, about the fear that lived in her chest like a cold stone. "He says I'm too much like her, too soft, too Indian." The last word came out as a whisper, heavy with shame. Jake felt anger flare in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Your mother was Apache?" "Part. Her grandmother was Chiricahua, like yours." Lucy's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for hours. "Wade says it's why I'm weak, why I cry too much, why I'll never amount to nothing." "Look at me," Jake said quietly. Lucy met his dark eyes, seeing something there that reminded her of her mother's stories about brave warriors. "You got warrior blood in your veins, Apache blood. That ain't weakness. That's strength that's been sleeping, waiting for the right time to wake up." As they approached Copper Creek, Lucy pressed close to Jake's chest, overwhelmed by the sight of other people, the sounds of normal life. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined with shops and a hotel that advertised hot baths and clean beds. Jake stopped at the general store first, buying Lucy new clothes and shoes while she waited outside with his horse. The storekeeper, a motherly woman named Mrs. Patterson, took one look at Lucy's condition and started clucking like an angry hen. "Good Lord, what happened to this child? She looks half-starved." Been through some hard times, Jake said simply. She needs kindness more than questions. Mrs. Patterson understood. Within an hour, Lucy was clean, fed, and dressed in new clothes that actually fit. She stared at herself in the store's mirror as if seeing a stranger, a girl who looked cared for, who looked worthy of care. They spent the afternoon walking through town, Jake introducing Lucy to shopkeepers and townspeople with the kind of quiet respect that made them see her as a person rather than a problem. At the schoolhouse, they met Miss Sarah Coleman, a young teacher who'd come west from Boston with dreams of educating frontier children. She's bright, Miss Coleman told Jake after spending an hour with Lucy. Quick to learn, curious about everything. With proper schooling, she could go far. That evening, they sat on the hotel porch watching the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Lucy had eaten more food that day than she usually saw in a week, and for the first time in months, she felt safe. I don't want to go back, she said quietly. Jake had been expecting this, hoping for it, dreading it. I know. He'll hurt me worse when you bring me back, for leaving, for telling people. Her voice trailed off. What if I told you there was another choice? Lucy looked at him with eyes too old for her face. What choice? Jake was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with a decision that would change both their lives. He thought of his grandmother, of Apache traditions about protecting the innocent, of the kind of man he wanted to be. I got family in Colorado. Good people who run a horse ranch near the mountains. They always said they'd welcome any child who needed a home. He met her gaze. It wouldn't be easy. You'd have to leave everything behind, start over completely. But you'd be safe. You'd be family. Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time they weren't tears of pain. You'd take me there? If that's what you want. But you got to understand, once we leave, there's no going back. Wade will come looking and we'll have to be ready for that. Lucy was quiet for a long time, watching the desert wind move through the sagebrush. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than Jake had heard it yet. My mama used to tell me stories about Apache women who rode with the warriors who fought for their freedom when they had to. She looked at Jake with something that might have been hope. She said sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose your own path even when it's dangerous. Jake nodded, understanding. So what's your choice? Lucy squared her shoulders, and for a moment Jake could see the warrior blood she carried, the strength that had been waiting to emerge. I choose freedom. As the last light faded from the sky, Jake began planning their escape, knowing that by morning they'd either be free or they'd be running for their lives. But looking at Lucy's face, determined now instead of defeated, he knew they'd made the right choice. Some chains were meant to be broken. They left Copper Creek before dawn, riding hard toward the mountains while the desert stars still gleamed overhead. Jake had traded his paint horse for 2 fresh mounts and supplies, knowing Wade would recognize the original animal. The sacrifice hurt. He'd had that horse for 3 years, but Lucy's freedom was worth more than any possession. Behind them, the town slowly came to life, unaware that 2 fugitives were racing toward an uncertain future. Jake had left a letter with the sheriff explaining the situation, knowing it would buy them time but not necessarily protection. In this territory, a man's word about his own property still carried weight, and legally, Lucy was Wade's responsibility. They rode through country that grew more rugged with each mile, following old Apache trails that Jake's grandmother had taught him during his youth. The landscape changed from desert scrub to pine forests, from red rock to snow-capped peaks that promised sanctuary for those brave enough to claim it. Lucy rode better than Jake had expected, sitting easy in the saddle despite her small size. The new clothes and good food had given her strength, but more importantly, The decision to choose her own path had given her courage. She no longer flinched at sudden sounds or watched the horizon with fearful eyes. "How much farther?" she asked as they stopped to rest the horses beside a mountain stream. "Another day's hard riding to my cousin's ranch. Thomas Crow Dog runs mustangs in the high country, sells them to the cavalry and local ranchers." Jake checked their back trail, looking for dust clouds that might signal pursuit. "Good man. Married a white woman who's got more Apache wisdom than most full-bloods I know." Lucy nodded, understanding the significance. In a world where bloodlines mattered, acceptance came from character rather than heritage. They were watering the horses when Jake spotted the dust cloud on their back trail, still distant but moving fast and straight toward them. His blood chilled as he counted the riders. 4 men, which meant Wade had brought his whole crew. "How'd they track us so quick?" Lucy asked, fear creeping back into her voice. Jake studied the approaching riders with the eye of an experienced scout. "Wade's got some tracker skills, and we ain't been hiding our trail much. Been more concerned with speed than stealth." He helped Lucy remount, his mind racing through options. They could try to outrun their pursuers, but the horses were already tired from the hard pace. They could find a defensive position and make a stand, but that would mean exposing Lucy to gunfire. Or, "There's a box canyon about a mile ahead," Jake said, making his decision. "Narrow entrance, sheer walls. If we can get you inside and hidden, I can hold them off at the mouth." "What if something happens to you?" Jake met her eyes, seeing the trust there that humbled him. "Then you follow that stream until it joins the main river, then head north until you find the Crow Dog Ranch. Tell them Jake sent you. They'll understand." They rode hard toward the canyon, Jake's mind automatically cataloging defensive positions and escape routes. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger, and soon they could make out individual riders. Wade rode in front, his face set in grim determination, while his men spread out in a hunting formation. The canyon entrance was barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, with towering walls that rose toward a thin slice of sky. Jake guided them deep into the narrow passage until they reached a small alcove where Apache warriors had once made camp. "Stay here," he told Lucy, helping her down and positioning her behind a boulder that would stop bullets. "No matter what happens, don't come out until you hear my voice calling all clear." Lucy grabbed his arm as he turned to go. "Jake, thank you for everything." He knelt beside her, this girl who'd become precious to him in the span of 2 days. "You remember what I told you about warrior blood?" She nodded. "You got choices ahead of you, Lucy. Hard choices, but you also got the strength to make them. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Jake positioned himself at the canyon mouth, using the rocks for cover while keeping the entrance in clear view. His rifle was loaded and ready, and he had his Colt as backup. Against 4 men his chances weren't good, but he'd faced worse odds in Apache country. Wade and his men appeared at the canyon entrance, moving cautiously now that they'd lost the advantage of open ground. Jake let them get halfway into the narrow passage before he called out, "That's far enough, Wade." The men reined in their horses, looking around for the source of the voice. Wade's face was flushed with rage and exhaustion. "Send out the girl and we'll call this even, Crow Dog." Jake felt a moment's surprise that Wade knew his name, then remembered that news traveled fast in small communities. "Can't do that." She made her choice. "She's a child. Children don't get to choose." "Maybe not where you come from, but Apache children learn early to think for themselves." Jake's voice echoed off the canyon walls, making it hard to pinpoint his position. "Question is, what you willing to do to get her back?" Wade dismounted, motioning for his men to spread out on foot. "Whatever it takes, she belongs to me." No one belongs to anyone, Wade. That's the thinking that got us into this mess. The first shot came from Roe, the nervous man who'd spoken out of turn back at the ranch. His bullet sparked off rock inches from Jake's head, and Jake returned fire, the sound booming through the canyon like thunder. Roe cried out and stumbled, clutching his shoulder. The fight was brief but intense. Wade's men had numbers, but Jake had position and experience. He moved through the rocks like smoke, appearing long enough to fire, then vanishing before return shots could find him. It was the kind of fighting his Apache ancestors had perfected, using the land itself as a weapon. When the shooting stopped, 2 of Wade's men were down, Roe with his shoulder wound, and another with a bullet in his leg. Wade himself had a graze across his cheek, and the 4th man had lost his nerve and was already riding hard back toward the desert. Wade stood alone in the canyon entrance, his gun empty, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been desperation. "This ain't over," he called out. "Yes, it is," Jake replied, stepping into view with his rifle trained on Wade's chest. "Go home, Wade. Find yourself a woman who wants to be there, instead of one you have to chain to the porch." Wade looked around at his wounded men, at the canyon walls that had become a trap, at the steady resolve in Jake's dark eyes. Slowly he raised his hands. "She'll come back," he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "When the world gets hard, she'll remember that I provided for her. Maybe, but it'll be her choice to make." Jake watched as Wade helped his wounded men onto their horses and rode away, growing smaller against the vast landscape until they disappeared entirely. Only then did he call out to Lucy. She emerged from her hiding place, pale but determined. "Is it over?" "This part is, but we still got a long road ahead." 3 days later they rode into the Crow Dog Ranch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas Crow Dog and his wife Sarah came out to greet them, their faces showing no surprise at Jake's arrival with a young girl in tow. "Family is family," Thomas said simply, helping Lucy down from her horse. "Blood or choice makes no difference here." That night, as Lucy slept safely in a real bed for the first time in months, Jake sat on the porch with his cousins, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain air. "She'll have nightmares for a while," Sarah said quietly. "Fear takes time to heal." "But she's strong," Thomas added. "I can see it in her eyes, Apache strong." Jake nodded, thinking of the long journey that had brought them here, of the choices that had changed both their lives. Lucy would grow up safe now, surrounded by people who understood that strength came in many forms, that tears were not weakness but wisdom. In the distance a coyote called to its pack, and Jake smiled at the sound. Some creatures were meant to run free, to choose their own path through the wilderness. Lucy had made that choice, and now she would learn what it meant to be truly free. The girl who had been chained to a porch for crying was gone. In her place was a young woman who would grow up knowing her own worth, her own power, her own unbreakable spirit. And that, Jake thought as he watched the stars wheel overhead, was worth any risk he'd taken to save her.